Someone close the door. Also, before we turn on the video camera, I just want to ask everyone in the room if they consent to being filmed. Are you sure?
Signing on the registration form.
Sorry?
That was also be recorded, so everyone that checked was not supposed to be here to film this.
Oh, fair.
Okay, well, I want to double check anyway. So everybody's fine? Everyone is fine with being recorded? Okay, great, interesting. Yeah, as long as we make sure that, I just wanted to check, but as long as we make sure that the video camera is turned off before the deliberation occurs, and there is no awkward streaming of. Melissa and Izzy and Ken? Okay, great. So I'd like to welcome everyone to round 3 of Worlds. I'm Nita and I'll be your chair of this panel. Accompanying me will be Izzy, she.
Melissa, she.
And without further ado, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to speak to the motion that bears her name. Yeah, I'll do that after.
You can start, I'm ready.
Sorry, can I just clarify, just for the sake of total specificity, the wording was natural, mineral, right? Mineral. Okay, good.
That's close enough. Yeah.
Just for the sake of my peace of mind. So currently, we live in a world where, analogously to the birth lottery, you do not choose the country that you are born into, and you do not choose the resources that your country happens to be gifted or not gifted with. You do not choose the amount of wealth that you therefore may or may not be more likely to experience during your lifetime. We would propose on this side of the house that we aggregate the amount of mineral resources that each country has, and then distribute that on a per capita basis to every individual. So we would make an international body to regulate this. That body would be specifically designed to achieve 3 main goals. The first of which is to minimize environmental harm as a result of extracting these resources. The second of which is to map out the amount of resources that exists in each country and to prolong the longevity of and the use of those resources in the long term. So obviously we would maximize all structural, economic and other sorts of planning. And the third is to maximize the profits that these that are able to be derived from these exercises as a byproduct of the second element of the purposes of that body. So there are 3 main points in this speech. The first is why nations do not have an absolute right to natural resources. Second, why our policy helps to correct inequality. And thirdly, how this decreases perverse incentives and political inertia on climate change. So to this first point, and as I touched on in my introduction, no individual chooses the country in which they are born. They do not choose, therefore, the sorts of wealth that their nation can necessarily exploit. You may be born into a country which has vast resources and therefore may be gifted with the ability for your government to make decisions on when it does and does not want to rely on these resources to provide you with profit and to provide you with services. However, on the other hand, you may be in a country that doesn't have those resources. You may also be born into a country where there is a corrupt government that does not elect to provide you with the benefits of those resources necessarily. By ensuring that these decisions are more collective, we can ensure better outcomes. And as a result of that, that moves me on to my second point, which is how we help to correct inequality. And we think that there are 3 main ways that this happens. The first of which is that the country has resources that it uses So we correct three sorts of inequality, I should clarify. The first form of inequality or inefficiency that we correct is that a country has resources that it uses inefficiently due to the political shortcut of saying we can manipulate the resources that we have to fulfill a particular political goal that helps us to win an election or helps us to score political points. By having the policy that we put into place, we create an incentive not to utilize resources inefficiently and extract them simply to solve political problems. We ensure that countries don't just use resources to create a domestic boom, but rather we create an incentive for cooperation globally, because when you're not just able to take out resources and directly channel the benefit of those resources into whatever political problem that you would like to remedy, and you can't necessarily make those promises to your population anymore, we actually create much more inefficient forms of economic planning, because now it isn't just as simple as a political party saying, I want to achieve X goal, I want to win, therefore I'm going to do X because I happen to be in power. Rather, it is now a global cooperation exercise where you're mapping out with this international regulatory body and your international fellows far more effectively how to maximize collective profit, because now you have to care about other countries. Now you have to care about something other than you as a political party in one country achieving your goal for as long as you're in power. You are bound to other countries and you are bound to more long-term economic planning. The second form of inefficiency and inequality that we solve is that many corrupt nations, as I touched on, don't redistribute effectively due to corruption within those particular states. So we think that really good examples of this are states like Venezuela and Mongolia. Venezuela is gifted with a vast amount of natural resources that it fails to distribute properly due to corrupt governance that is incredibly difficult to fix in the short term. We totally bypass the problem of corrupt governments by making sure that every individual has the ability to access some of those profits. We do not rely upon that country as a conduit through which the poor achieve some form of remedy and some form of financial assistance. We can now ensure at a base level that the individuals in these corrupt nations who are on, in many cases, very resource reliant, now have some funds that they can rely upon and have some form of benefit. And this at least is better than the alternative when it was never clear and we could never force those countries to redistribute those profits. The third way in which we think that we remedy inefficiency and inequality are in countries where they utilize resources too quickly. So we think that in places like the UAE, which is predicted to run out of resources by 2050, and where their entire form of political governance and the way in which they maintain stability is to provide each individual with a house and to provide each individual with total socialized benefits that is contingent upon continuously extracting that oil that is going to run out, that it creates an incentive for them to just continuously rip out oil in order to satisfy those continuous needs. What changes now is that you can't just do that anymore. You are forced to diversify your economy. You are now forced to branch out into tourism or service-based industries to be able to maintain that same level of revenue. Or if you can't maintain that same level of revenue, you cannot promise your population any longer things you could not sustainably deliver to them. You are then forced to make sure that you engage in more pragmatic and realistic long-term economic planning, and you have other countries and an international regulatory body to hold you accountable in a way that you were never accountable before. This ensures that there are vastly more long-term economic benefits because you're forced to diversify to other industries and you are forced to engage in long-term unselfish economic planning.
You talk about corrupt governments diversifying, but factually this is incorrect when we see Putin's economy falling apart and he still does not diversify. Their leadership is not based on results. Their leadership is based on something different. You don't get your benefits.
We do get our benefits because if you listen to my matter, now there is a collective interest. Putin isn't just making decisions for Putin. Putin simply cannot make decisions for his own political gain. He cannot be that short-sighted anymore functionally because he cannot promise his people and he cannot even functionally fulfill the role himself of being able to make sure that the amount of profit that he thinks he can extract from resources in Russia can actually be distributed in the way that he thinks that they will be, because now they are being aggregated and distributed to everybody. Putin functionally cannot do that. Moving on then to the third point in this speech, which is how this decreases perverse incentives and political inertia on climate change. And we think that Putin is actually a really good example of that because Putin doesn't give a fuck about climate change. He basically does whatever he wants to do in order to facilitate Russia's economic growth in the short term. We think that it actually decreases people like Putin's political inertia on things like climate change because now they can't make the excuse of saying, I'm going to maximize all of my profits now to deliver some benefit for Russia, because now you're not getting all of those profits functionally, so you have much less of an excuse to abuse and manipulate the environment in the ways that people like Putin can currently justify on the basis of a murky and immediate economic gain. We stop people like that in their tracks and force them to be more accountable for the economic and environmental harms that they are exacting in the societies in which they operate. Because now you're not hoarding profits because you functionally can't, and you're accountable to not only your population but a global society at large. For all of those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for her comments, and now I'd like to welcome the opposition leader.
Panel, we're confused by the case of Macquarie government. We're confused as to two questions. First of all, are they passing the money round the back of political leaders directly to people, at which point we think it's highly unlikely political leaders, the type of which they talk about, are going to be willing to stand for this because it's undermining their power. Even if they get around that, I mean, there are systematic problems from development perspectives that arise in that. But even if it's distributed directly to the government leaders, they still have the same problem of corruption. But you also lack large amounts of capital that allow these countries to develop in a way that is fundamentally different than the world that arrives from the conclusion of their model. What we're going to bring you in this point is twofold. First of all, we're going to tell you what happens to nations when they can develop using the assets that nature has provided to them and why they're legitimate quickly in doing so. And second, we're going to look at what the actual counterfactual is on their side, how development occurs, and why the development is ultimately structurally worse and makes these countries ultimately more dependent on a global scheme. But first of all, 2 points of rebuttal. First of all, the idea that these countries aren't already diversifying is fundamentally untrue. Saudi Arabia has stated that it is cutting oil production for the explicit purpose of attempting to spur innovation in its economy. The fact that oil is ultimately an unprofitable investment at the minute in Saudi Arabia is motivating individuals to take that money and put it into other sectors in the economy. So diversification is ultimately occurring across the region. But also, they then say these countries are acting in a short-term selfish interest and maximising their short-term profits. That fundamentally isn't true. Note the signing of the Paris deal restricted massively the ability of these countries to extract these resources and has actual tangible punishments for those countries if they break them. So there is already commitments to long-term sustainability goals that they want to talk about. Again, we're wondering what world they are talking about. Right, quickly, why do we think duty-wise, and why do we think ethically these countries are justifiable in keeping hold of these resources? We think in a world in which history had never existed and we arrive on this planet arbitrarily, then yes, the fact that certain geographical areas happen to have more diamonds, more gold, or more oil, or more coal was probably unfair. But we think, given the history of this planet, where certain nations used the ability and power that they had to exploit the mineral resources of other nations and lock them into systemic crises of development, we think it's probably legitimate for those nations to restrict access to those minerals in the future. Why? Because what happens on their side? In order to maximize profit, you must reduce costs as much as possible. So two answers to that. First of all, profit will always be less than total revenue because total revenue is revenue minus cost. Profit is revenue minus cost. Sorry, I do economics, that's terrible. But what we say ultimately is countries under status quo negotiate trade licenses and extraction licenses based on revenue. Not based on profit, based on revenue. That means they get a guaranteed share of the money that company makes even before they cover their costs. That's a large chunk of money they're guaranteed on the table under status quo. That changes under their side at the point at which these resources are aggregated because it's a common resource which you can't lock out access to. So you're not able to negotiate a better economic deal for your country, and that's a massive problem in terms of actual wealth creation. But second of all, we'd say we're morally justified to do so due to the fact that this is literally the best way for these countries to get out of dependency. This leads me into what dependency and what ultimately development out of this perspective looks like. So the vast majority of these countries are so-called rentier economies. They're economies where there is low tax but high amounts of public services because it's funded on the back of in the short term on these mineral resources. That leads importantly to two things. First of all, it leads to a slow rollout of a democratic and more representative state. The reason for that is quite simple. I can provide you with services that secure your loyalty as a state that provides you with things that you like, such as housing, such as education, such as all the things that as a citizen you want, but I don't tax you a lot. That means that you gain popularity, I gain your affection without inflicting a massive harm on you in the short term. That means you have a loyalty to me that arises because of that transaction. And ultimately what happens is that builds up buy-in into those states. That's ultimately what these states lacked. What these states have lacked, no thank you, is the ability of their citizens to be willing to commit to them into the long term, the ability of the citizens to work to develop those nations. The success period of this was the period of ISI, industrial state-led development, development in Latin America, and I know back-half speaker wants to react to that. The reason why ISI ultimately failed is exactly why is the second part of my argument, which is the type of development that your side leads to. So I'll get to that later. But what you had at the time was large-scale governments that had broad representation, that provided public services to their citizens in a way that allowed them to buy into that state. Ultimately destroyed democracy in those regions was the fact that when the United States pushed on an increase, global interest rate increase, it destroyed the ability of those nations to ultimately fund themselves. They might say that that's an issue of not diversifying. You can't diversify when you give them less money because the profits are smaller than revenue, but also distribute that money far too narrowly across the system. The issue is that you need a large state-led actor to do this because they can do things like set up a brand new port that leads to more exports for your economy. They can build a railway network that allows for transport. They can do all these things that make your state tangibly better. 200,000 individuals who just manage to get a chunk of money may buy things, but those things primarily come from abroad, which means there's a net transfer of wealth back out of your country anyway, so you don't get that type of development. Go ahead.
So did this economic sustainability and development ever exist in states such as Venezuela, which controlled their resources, or alternatively in African nations or other nations where European nations took those resources and exploited them?
Yes, it has, because Nigeria has developed massively on the back of oil revenues. Venezuela is an outlier case because the massive rise in leftist populism that you saw, specifically of the controlling kind of Venezuela, was a direct result of the fact that this system was undermined by the type of development that they were forced to carry out. So second point, what is the type of development that these nations were forced to carry out? So they were forced to carry out, and will be forced to carry out on the proposition model, a type of development based on borrowing money from abroad, based on opening up your market, based on increasing your paper GDP, not increasing your actual ability to be a sustainable economy. So what does that look like? First of all, you take large amounts of loans because you don't have a mineral wealth to back up the investment you have in your economy. So you take out loans from the global markets, oftentimes that are lent to you on the expectation that you will either A, default, and they'll be able to inflict very savage conditions on your economy. Note that most of the conditions that have been attached to these type of deals have been opening up your economy to foreign companies. What that does is it completely destroys your domestic sector, the type of domestic industrial and development that leads to your country being able to compete. They don't get that. Why? Because when those governments have to depend on that aid, there's no incentive for investment, and particularly global development, to turn you into a competitor to them. There's an incentive to keep you in a nice position where you are consuming from them, but not actively competing with them. When you have a large source of mineral wealth that you can restrict access to and charge a higher price for, that means you're able to take that and turn yourself into a competitor against these much larger economies. That is what Brazil have massively done with oil and gas revenues. They restricted access and used that to develop themselves into now one of the foremost developing economies in the world. They would lock out the rights of many other countries like Ecuador and Bolivia and Algeria and the rest of the MENA countries to get access to that type of wealth. Ultimately what they do is set these countries up to continue a path of developmental failure that hasn't worked. They take away the rights of the countries to restrict access to the type of development that gives them a better quality of life, and for those reasons we're proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the opposition leader for his comments, and now I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Madam Speaker, you and I both come from a country that relies on its huge tracts of mineral wealth and its mineral resources to fund its economy and has become incredibly lazy and is refusing to diversify in any meaningful way. Australia is definitely headed towards a point where they either have to start diversifying or they're going to cause massive environmental harm, not have sustainable long-term growth, and eventually basically not be able to provide the services and the quality of life that many Australians have come to expect. Australia is a first world country. This is the case for a country like Australia. What is the situation for countries like Venezuela, for countries like Mongolia, for many African nations who are struggling to try and get their foot off the ground after years and centuries of colonial exploitation? At this point, ladies and gentlemen, it is imperative that we have some sort of change. We cannot sit back on ridiculous neoliberal economic ideology, which the opening of wanted to sort of put forward, because we think development has moved beyond that. Development is not about going with the classical confines. We have to go beyond it. This model goes beyond it. This model offers a real, legitimate solution. We don't see anything from the to solve these very pressing problems. So very quickly, a point of clarification, and then 2 points in the speech will be sort of integrated. So firstly, this point of clarification, which they asked us, who distributes this money? Are they going behind people's backs? Obviously, the international body is distributing this. We made this quite clear. We think it's quite analogous to how the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund would distribute money as well. At the point where obviously there are corrupt leaders who do tend to sort of absorb this money coming through, we will take every effort possible to minimize that corruption. We think that can happen when there's a situation of everyone's resources being pulled together. Every single nation now has an incentive to make sure that that money is not being absorbed by corrupt despotic leaders and is being given to the people in accordance with these deals that they've signed up for. So at the point where that's happening, we don't see that sort of issue necessarily rising, or where it does arise, it's minimized. So we think that resolves over there. So, on to these more substantive points. So firstly, do leaders even have an incentive to comply? Secondly, development, how does it happen? Is integrated my substantive. So firstly, do leaders even have an incentive to comply? We heard firstly that all these nations really corrupt, so therefore they don't have an incentive to begin with. Why would you want to sign up to this? It obviously is against the interest. Second thing we heard is that because it decreases the revenue, decreases your economic negotiation power, therefore why on earth would you want to do this? A couple of responses, Madam Speaker. Firstly, again, even though there may be corruption in a lot of these places, we think the fact of the matter is a lot of people would realize, and there'd be enough political will, we think, in the international community to make this happen, simply because it is the benefit that you derive from this is so enormously great. Every single person in the world, Madam Speaker, because that means per capita, for those who are confused, will be getting more money on average. It means that people are getting an equal amount of money across the world. It means that people who necessarily have I guess weaker currencies are getting a significant amount of boost over there as well. So even if there is a corrupt state doesn't want to do it, the sheer force of international law that we think will arise because of the huge amounts of benefits that derive from this is likely to overcome that, or at least have some sort of effective remedy to overcome that as well. The second thing about decrease in revenue, decrease in economic negotiation power, we think economic negotiation power is particularly potent in countries that already have a very large standing, like the United States or like China or like Russia or like Australia, which already have these huge amounts of mineral resources they are extracting and have been having very powerful negotiation situations with these companies anyway. We think all this does actually is increases the economic negotiation power for a lot of the countries that don't already have that kind of international backing and standing. See countries like Mongolia, which already have huge amounts of their minerals being extracted without really any sort of revenues and profits going back to them in a way that is actually conducive for them over there. So even if some of these big, huge countries have a decreased incentive or decreased revenue coming through, we think that the sheer fact that all these other nations, which are getting so many more benefits because the increased revenue coming through to them, would be sort of part of international pressure as well to get it all together and get increased revenue as well. So even to the extent there will be some leaders who don't have an incentive to comply, we think the sheer amount of benefits to derive from this international will that is likely to arise from this, given the wake of things like the Paris 2020 climate talks, is likely to result in some sort of action. And at the point where you say, oh, no one's going to agree to this ever, why did we set this motion? So, second, development, how does it even happen? So, firstly, they told us that, countries are not actually acting in short-term interests. Many are already committed to long-term interests. The second thing they told us is that the public is not committed to long-term interests because they can't, if you can't diversify when you don't have enough money, therefore you can't distribute anything, what is the public going to buy into in the first place, not to mention the public doesn't have long-term thought process going on. Third thing they told us is that restricting capital reduces the competitive advantage that you already have. Restricting capital increases the competitive advantage you have and helps economies like, for example, Brazil go on further and develop. So a couple of responses. Firstly, Madam Speaker, if these countries are so focused on long-term interests, how are they also corrupt and ridiculous, right? If these countries are focused on their long-term interests and not being on short-term stuff, they will obviously want to buy into this sort of model. If they have long-term interests at heart, this is what they want to do. This is in their exact long-term interest. Second thing, often these sorts of plans fail simply because the short-term bursts of capital going into there never really aren't really enough. You need long-term amounts of money and revenue going in steadily so people can have savings. You can have a steady growth rate, so you can have steady inflation. It's not enough to have short bursts of capital coming in. That's never sustainable. So in response to the second and third points, as I flagged before, this is kind of like a very neoliberal economic paradigm. We completely reject it, right? Because neoliberal policies have never worked. And this idea of like, you need to restrict capital, you need to make sure that you hoard all the capital over there. We think that is absurd. We don't want to bind to this idea that you should all be restricting your capital, you should all be hoarding everything together. Because I think it's important that economies, especially countries in today's like current economic climate and current economic climate as well, come together and actually think about these things more carefully rather than going to the classic neoliberal ideas which have only served the interests of powerful colonial nations. Opening.
Okay, so if you agree that like neoliberalism shouldn't be thought as a policy, why do you reduce the amount of money that these countries receive? Because you're only distributing a share of profits based on their population, rather than giving them the majority of the revenue that will be extracted from their resources.
Well, firstly, because that's what the topic told me to do, and secondly, our model does allow for like maximizing those profits to as much as they possibly can be, and because now we won't have tax havens, because obviously you can't anymore under this, that's resolved as well. So now integrating my substantive into this, how this improves long-term economic outcomes for developing nations. This runs directly to all the economic analysis we got from opening up. So under the status quo, we have some developing countries who do have mineral resources that they would ordinarily extract to sell to increase revenue and capital spur growth. That is the classical idea or neoliberal ideas of how you can increase growth and your development over there. But many of these resource companies exploit the lack of property rights in a lot of these nations. They have no incentive to minimize their environmental harm and often end up causing a lot of damage to indigenous populations over there as well. So we have all those huge harms on that side. The comparative on our side is that resources are still extracted, you still have that capital being raised, but you get much fairer profits because now this model means that you have to comply by the international regulations to maximize those profits. You can't go around exploiting these people. Secondly, you now have the backing of international law to ensure you have your property rights protected, so you can't have that exploited over there. And thirdly, of course, obviously, like our massive environmental policy protections over here, so you can't go around damaging Canada with this tar pits and stuff like that. You can't go around, causing damage to water tables like you do in Australia. These are the kind of things, Madam Speaker, that we're trying to resolve in this debate. We're the only team that is actually offering a viable solution, trying to resolve extremely pressing issues. If we stick with the neoliberal ideas coming out from the opposition bench, we are never going to get anything resolved. All these countries are going to go under. It's a massive harm, Madam Speaker. We are so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her comments, and I'd like to welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue the case.
Panel, I want to talk to you about two things in this extension. I want to talk to you about neo-colonialism being brought back in but framed as equality and why it's inherently harmful. And second of all, I want to talk to you about worse mining and environmental effects and how politically this will lead to the ruination of developing countries and ultimately develop Daniel's points. Okay, rebuttal will be interwoven. Okay, neo-colonialism framed as equality. Right, so the first speaker, the Prime Minister in fact, stands up and says that choice is massively, massively important in this debate, and that choice is what is unfair because we essentially have a birth lottery for minerals. You didn't get to choose like what country you were born into, you didn't get to choose the minerals. Daniel goes on to explain to you that that may have been true if this was like the debate was set at day dot, the day that the earth was created. But no, we live in a world that colonialism has existed, in which wealthier imperial countries have created a system in which poorer developing countries are economically locked into a system where they have less resources and less infrastructure, right? The problem with choice in this system is those countries never got to choose colonialism, never got to choose what happened to them, and never got to choose the fact that their economies are now struggling, right? Their economies are struggling to the point where often these infrastructures, these resources are the only thing that can possibly save them, right? The wealthiest and often most politically powerful nations in the world at the moment have the least resources, right? So if we look at the USA and the UK, people who have a lot of power, do not Okay, there are other wealthy nations who have resources. However, if this motion was to be put in place, they would not be that wealthy because their wealth is derived from resources. The wealth I mean is, infrastructural wealth, IT wealth, modern things that aren't part of this motion. Those countries have a lot less resources, right? This motion takes money away from some of the poorest economies or economies who have grown in spite of colonialism, like Greece, like a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and to some extent like Australia, right? We say that this motion takes the money away from those people who have fought to develop those infrastructures and their national wealth, and gives it back to the people who put them in that position in the first place. If they want to bring you a principled argument as to why the world must share their resources, they must have engaged in a principled argument in why those people have a right to it in the first place. Furthermore, more so than we all live in one land mass. That is not a principally consistent case, right? Daniel asked you why this was okay in a POI. We got a fairly glib answer saying that the motion told them to do that. Then we get an answer that says, our model allows us to increase profits, and therefore everything's still okay. But inherently that's just still flawed, because even if there are increased profits, you still get less of that money, because even if you only got 40% of the profit beforehand, now you get maybe the profit is increased slightly, but not enough to counteract the fact that you no longer have control over your profit margin, over who you sell to, over the fact that you get to choose when you're taking out the oil and taking out the coal and taking out the diamonds and whatever it is, right? We say that ultimately means that the countries they are worrying about the most, the countries who are poor, the countries who are struggling, the countries who can't deal with the fact that they, the birth lottery, I suppose, those countries are screwed over the most because they don't get to make the decisions that currently they do, right? We say comparatively this is far worse. We say ultimately the world isn't the perfect place, and we would much rather if developing countries could have lovely infrastructures and things like that. But seeing as we live in a world where they don't, and OG have given us no mechanism as to how infrastructures or education or any other form of money-making activity would improve in these countries other than maybe people will be nice, and I'll get onto that in a moment, and all work together. We don't think that this is a right thing or a just thing for a global nation, no thank you, to do, right? Note they tell you that, actually no, I'll get onto that in a minute, so I won't do that now, right? This motion, no thank you, rewards countries whose resources were valuable in the past, like US and UK. The fact that they used to be able to retract lots and lots of coal, and that is what was needed for those economies to develop. It harms new countries and new developing countries with with different resources and different forms of minerals that can actually benefit them. We say that is principally incorrect and illegitimate when the countries I spoke about, like the UK and the US, literally have a lot of the money in the world, have a lot of the wealth in the world, and continue to propagate a lot of the problems in the world, like world debt. Literally they could wipe the debt clean if they wanted to. They're refusing to do that. No thank you. Mining and environmental effects, right? So this will go into the political background of it as well. No thank you, I said no 3 seconds ago. Okay, so deep coal extraction versus flat coal extraction. So to explain this, the wealthier nations like the UK and Australia, who have a history of mining and a history of doing this, have deep coal extraction. That means there is a long shaft that goes about 2 miles underground, and then they can dig away at the coal or the diamonds or whatever they're doing, and then they can bring it back up, and then this is environmentally sound, and it means that less people get killed, and everything's a lot better, right? This is because they did all the dangerous stuff hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and they don't really care about that anymore, right? Problem is developing nations engage in flat mining because it is far cheaper than building shaft mines and things like that. The problem with that is that means you get a large pit, which means lots and lots and lots of smog, right? This means that there is it literally ruins environments, right? So when you I'll take you in 20 seconds. When you can stand if you want. When you take coal out of the ground, this releases smog. This happens a lot more in flat mining because it's literally going directly into the air. It also ruins the ground, it ruins the soil. So this motion literally takes resources from developing nations more and more and more. We'll tell you why, because Western countries who it isn't their soil getting ruined, it isn't their air getting ruined, it isn't any of their things getting ruined, they're going to be very happy to vote for that resources to be taken out.
The post-colonial countries you were talking about involve a reality where the poorest get little to no benefit from the resources left. Why are you all right with these people continuing to lose out?
You literally never proved how they would get more on your side. I'm going to prove to you in a second why that is. Okay, so just to finish on this smog point, literally it ruins the environment, right? Examples of this being terrible are in Delhi, they literally removed all unessential people from the embassies because they were fearful for their health. In China, people live a way less less life expectancy, right? We are not legitimate in reducing the life of people for some marginal profitable benefits for every single country. Right. So, to answer your POI more so now. Okay, so the majority often benefit, and they outweigh minority suffering. So I've explained why more minorities will suffer in this. So Western countries or richer countries or whatever can use powers that they have to make sure that things get extracted, right? US citizens literally don't care if the Congo have smog and are all dying because it doesn't have a benefit for them. They want to tell you that people will think long term because international communities will work together and there'll be collective action. We tell you this is just principally not true in terms of people wouldn't be extracting so much from the earth right now if they thought long term. They don't. They think short term. They think profit margins. They think about the lovely words that OG said, and they don't think of all the harms that Daniel and I brought you, which outweigh their benefits. We beg you to close.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Opposition Leader for her comments, and now I'd like to welcome the Government Member.
Following the introduction of the Washington Consensus in 1989, we saw a global economy be built around the exploitation of poor nations. And I think this extends very, very hardly to the exploitation of poor nations in regards to their minerals. What Jamil and I want to bring on closing government is a conception where we want to argue that this motion is the best mechanism through which we can give power back to these nations by reducing multinational power itself and the incentive structure to make more profit. I think it's quite simple. I'm going to be talking about two main points. It's basically 3 points, but it's under 2 main points. The first is what I've cheekily called to mine or not to mine, saying whether either in a situation they're going to these companies are either going to stop mining, or if they want to continue mining, it is going to be a better form of mining. Then I'm going to be talking about exploitation. Then I'm going to be going through extensive refutation of everything we've heard out of side opposition. So under this point, I think that under the status quo, mining is very profitable for particular nations. It is a very, very individualistic process by which there's oftentimes very little regulation, and there's a quick maximization of revenue that exists. We think now that these multinational corporations are very, very focused on the bottom line, maximizing their profits themselves. They're going to recognize that in order to share, if they were to follow along with these policies and they want to continue mining, they're going to have to share their wealth. I think that what this ultimately, this calculus that these multinational corporations are quite evidently going to accept is that we have to reduce mining because these particular sectors, these particular habits are not the ones that are going to be bringing us the most profit. And I think that following that simple logic, it is very, very likely that we're going to see less mining occur, particularly from these multinational corporations. We're going to see that their profit has to be divided amongst the entire world. It's not something that they can sit on and hoard any longer. What this means ultimately is that with less mining actually happening, with less of these corporations actually going out and using their oftentimes exploitative techniques, which I'll talk about a little bit later, we think that there's going to ultimately be less pollution just by the fact that there's going to be less mining. But let's say that these corporations want to continue, they want to continue making profit, and they have to generate more money. I think that the only option that they're going to want is to be able to generate more profit on the whole, so that their share of the pie is going to be even larger. And I think that the only way that they're going to be able to accomplish this is through cooperation. I think that this is extremely beneficial for all of the actors involved. Because I think when all countries recognize that they can benefit from one another, this is going to lead to more cooperation. For example, in Bolivia, there are extreme amounts of lithium reserves that are sitting unattended and gathered. And the problem with that is Bolivia could profit a lot. a lot of other nations could profit a lot. And I think that under our mechanism, under this system that we're specifically providing, there is incentives for these nations to go in specifically and aid them because they know that it's going to increase the pie and the wealth that everybody's going to be getting, right? And I think that that is necessarily the only system under which this is going to be happening, right? We think that oftentimes in like Bolivia, for example, Jamil's going to give you more examples because whatever. I think that oftentimes they lack the capacity to like remove these things, and it's just oftentimes sitting there, no thank you, just stand. And now we see that there's going to oftentimes be a lot more like aid and particular assistance. So I'll go into this in two main points. We think that ultimately it's going to lead to better extraction. In what ways? In regards to efficiency, no thank you. I think that there's just going to be like better tools, there's going to be a lot better like systems set up, and it's just going to get these things out of the earth faster, it's oftentimes going to get them out better, and it's going to lead to more profit overall. But secondly, and more importantly, I think that there's going to oftentimes be more oversight, and there's going to oftentimes be more regulations put in place. When we see that developed nations are coming into developing nations and offering their support, offering their assistance. Because once these nations come in, they have to abide by a certain regulation that they themselves have to abide by as well, because their reputation is on the line, because their international status is on the line. So when they engage in like extracting lithium in Bolivia, I think that necessarily they're going to have to be upheld to a certain standard. I'm going to be talking about how this is going to like help them escape from the poverty gap a little bit later, because that fits. No, thank you. Just stand or raise your hand. Escape from the poverty gap, much easier. Let's talk about exploitation first, because although they kind of mentioned it, I'm surprised they didn't really expand on it, so I'm going to do this right now. As I previously outlined, I think that what is currently like the mindset of either like a small corporation or a large multinational corporation is oftentimes a very individualistic approach from these particular actors. And I think that what this means is there's oftentimes going to be much more exploitation coming from these. They oftentimes don't care about the workers that they're employing. They oftentimes just want to simply make the most money. And like blood diamonds, I think, is a perfect example within this debate that has not been discussed. We think that necessarily when that profit motive disappears, when all of these things are going to be calculated, when there's going to be government oversight, when you can't like funnel money through the back channels anymore, we think that ultimately, I'll take back half in a second, we think ultimately that when you remove this profit motive, these practices will slowly disappear. We're not saying that they're going to disappear overnight, but we think that they're slowly going to disappear, or there's going to be a lot more regulation placed on it, at which point they will disappear. Go ahead.
There are places in Africa in which it's already difficult enough to get people to mine there because of how difficult it is. Why would this encourage a country to mine if they know that that money is going to be divided up amongst other countries?
Because no, like I already discussed this, like I'm not going to waste my time on it. I think we should just like go into a little bit more refutation. It's going to be absolutely more direct and much more important. Okay, let's talk about all of the refutation, or all of the points actually that came out of the opening opposition. So they first start off basically saying, and this is like a 1.5 point that they spent way too much time on. They were talking about like how nations need their resources to improve the quality of life for their citizens and for their nations. They should have complete control over this. As I kind of alluded to in my introduction, though, and Jamil alluded to in a great POI, the way in which the international system and the international economy is built is not that these individual nations, like a small particular nation, is going to have access to this. Oftentimes it's multinational corporations that own land, that own all the machinery and infrastructure that is built around this. And I think that's because under the Washington Consensus, oftentimes these things became very privatized. What this means is that multinational corporations now have complete control, and they limit the amount of money that these particular nations are going to be receiving. Under our side of the house, these nations are going to be receiving, I think, marginally more money because they're finally going to get a piece of the pie back. Whereas we think under the status quo, they're just absolutely controlled by these particular multinational corporations that are set up. Second point, they talk about like no incentive to make nations competitive, blah, blah, blah. This is already the status quo. At least in the comparative, these nations are receiving some wealth as opposed to virtually none. Then they say like this motion takes away money from developing nations. I've already said this, but we think that most of these developing nations are already have their resources held and controlled by multinationals. And then they said, give us a mechanism for how developing nations are going to be benefited. We're going to say that this money is basically like a form of like virtual foreign investment, direct investment that is coming to these nations. And this money that they will not otherwise receive is going to necessarily help them escape from the poverty gap. It's necessarily going to help them develop substantially. For everything I've said, everything Jamil will say, we're very proud to do for those.
I'd like to thank the government member for his comments, and now I'd like to welcome the opposition member.
Oh, I hope not. Thank you, Honorable Chair. My partner Brittany and I want to do for today is bring a principle that's different from maximizing profits and development. What we're going to tell you is that the team line coming out of closing opposition specifically is going to be maintaining the legitimacy of governmental agency, specifically in vulnerable states. And notice I'm using the word vulnerable and not developing. All going to distinguish ourselves from opening opposition very clearly in my positive manner. But before I do that, let's take care of some housekeeping, which I think needs to be done. We'll start with the first argument of maximization of profits from the member of government. And the member of government does something very interesting. He admits in the same breath that less foreign interest is present in the states after this policy. And therefore, we would tell you that the maximization of profits is hurt by this sort of policy. So when the pie, as he so eloquently puts it, must be shared, there is less foreign investment in these nations, which equals less power given to these vulnerable states. We would tell you, and I'll go on to emphasize in my positive manner, that power is everything to these developing nations. But secondly, he gives you an argument about blood diamonds and how profit sharing can probably stop these practices. And our response is, well, maybe. I mean, yeah, you could be right. But we think it's probably better to attack these sorts of improper practices of blood diamonds by having policies aimed at limiting the importation of diamonds to America. We can address the problems that he talks about with blood diamonds and the exploitation of individuals in these developing nations in another way than distributing aggregate mineral resources. We think those policies are probably more effective than this. And we would prefer those policies as opposed to this because of the harms that this brings. So let's get to his last argument. Multinational interest limits the amount of money to the vulnerable states. We think this is actually counterintuitive, right? We think that when you analyze the situation, at the point where multinational interests are involved in these states, we would tell you that status quo, they do receive money. They do receive something. It's not nothing as he would tell you. Let's go on to why that's so. So let's talk about why we accept the contribution of the examples brought up by the opening government of Mongolia and Australia, but we would prefer to refocus this debate on more important contextualized examples of where the majority of mineral resources are located in the world, being the continent of Africa. And more particularly, we'll give you a case study of Africa in the terms of the mineral deposits that are often located in landlocked nations. Now, I'll clarify our distinction from opening opposition as it becomes more apparent. Let's start with the condition of vulnerable states. And notice that I use the word vulnerable here and not developing. And this is because, to sum up our contention in very minimalist terms, we contend that mineral deposits are often one of the only sources of power, only sources of income for these states, and taking that away drowns these states very clearly. Now, we'll begin by explaining the journey that most minerals take, which we wish we had heard a little bit earlier in this round, because I think it's important to contextualize where these minerals are coming from. So first, valuable mineral deposits, such as opening opposition talked to you about, diamonds and gold, but also copper, also ferrous minerals such as iron. These are all critically important to these nation states, and let's not ignore them. Now, this often looks like these minerals coming from the continent of Africa, and the continent of Africa has certain states which have higher deposits of this, right? So it looks like landlocked nations like Chad or Kenya having higher deposits of ferrous minerals, which is really important. Now, let's talk about why this geographically is important when you compare it to nations like Zimbabwe. So geographically, this is important because most mineral deposits occur in landlocked nation states, arid states, where riverbeds have dried up over time and evaporated to reveal the markers for deposits. Now, this nuance is critical because it gives us the understanding that mineral deposits are often the only source of power or wealth in these landlocked nations, because being landlocked in Africa is nigh akin to a death sentence, very clearly. Being landlocked in sub-Saharan Africa, where your only means of economic importation are reliant upon the roads that might be flooded depending on the season. It's really important that you have a sustainable source of income and resource when you don't have access to the sea or other sorts of things like that. So under governmental policy, under the governmental bench, the aggregate collection and removal of these resources, regardless of if they're going to tell you it's prolonged, because let's be honest, it's going to run out eventually, right? So regardless of whether or not it's prolonged, the aggregate collection leads to a lacking of power for these nation states, particularly the landlocked states. So opening opposition specifically talked about development and economic effects. We'd like to discuss the overarching principle with this contextualized example established of why sovereignty and nation states have a duty to retain these mineral deposits. So we think that when it comes to international debt to other nations, which seem to be the premise, the assumption of governmental bench, that we all owe it to humanity to do this, we would fundamentally disagree. And we would tell you that this is largely presumed. And we would tell you additionally that we don't see enough link work coming from the governmental bench to show why a nation with sovereignty ought to surrender that sovereignty for other humans' benefit. And make no mistake, This is a surrendering of sovereignty, when the only thing that maintains your sovereignty is this minimalistic source of power. So we posit, therefore, the governmental agency should always act out of should never act out of benevolent interest towards other nations when those benevolent actions cause harm to its own citizens. Put very simply, we've heard this a lot of times before, governmental agency has a primary duty to provide for itself. So before I go on to emphasize that, please.
Your idea relies on, like, having these sort of power structures centered on incredibly unstable markets of minerals, and doesn't actually guarantee any sort of money going to the poorest of the poor, which guarantees more stability. How do you get sovereignty, stability, anything under your side?
Okay, so first of all, they're not unstable markets. There's a reason that blood diamonds are still imported to America every year, and why it's not only a growing industry, but an expanding industry in landlocked nations. But secondly, we would tell you that there's a lot of tension in this case, and I'll go on to emphasize that in just one second with the logical fallacy. So this is a good time to emphasize the part of the motion that governmental bench is very happy to gloss over, the per capita part. This was prefaced in a POY by our opening opposition. Let's explain this logical fallacy of the governmental bench. So we think that the very discomfort of opening government on developing states being at the mercy of larger states, as was the POY just given, is actually the same when larger states, like those on the continent of Europe, the oppressors that they gave to you, will receive more money simply because they have more people per capita living in their nation state, as opposed to the nation of Chad, as opposed to these landlocked nations that do not have a lot of people. Their policy only exacerbates the sort of discomfort that they would bring to you in the beginning of this debate. But furthermore, we would tell you that when these nations draw the short end of the stick, just because they don't have a lot of people in them, that does not ameliorate nor alleviate the problems that these nations face, the problems that these citizens inside these sovereign nations face. This links to our analysis on national duty, where we say that the problems of humanity, as outlined by the governmental bench, ought to be the concern of those nations capable of addressing it, not those nations that have a duty to their citizens first. And we tell you that nations like Chad are not capable of addressing other problems when they have their own problems to deal with first. So because the duty of these vulnerable states dictates a rejection of governmental policy, because the duty of governmental agency in principle rejects this policy, and upholding that principle is the only way to maintain legitimate government within these sub-Saharan African states. When governmental bench's policy clearly harms governmental agency and these vulnerable states, we do nothing but oppose.
I'd like to thank the member speaker for his comments, and now I'd like to invite the government whip speaker.
Okay, so what I'd like to do for you today is really break this down and look at why this is actually going to be something, or the policy that we're providing to you today is going to be something that is going to actually benefit the development of these states, but something that's also going to bolster their economy and actually lead to a form of development that is better than the neoliberal policies that are being blatantly put out from all of opposition bench. I think everything that they propose relies off of the fact that neoliberal policies are something that still actually aid developing countries in development and don't actually hinder their development and don't actually lead to further underdevelopment and a poverty trap for these types of countries. I think that's something that they've negated all across the bench and something that I really want to go into. What I'm going to do for you is actually go into refutation of what we hear about these vulnerable states, then go into a rebuilding of Luca, and then actually look at how countries are actually going to develop the best. Okay, first thing. If we look at this whole idea that he talks about in terms of vulnerable nations, he basically explains that landlocked nations like Kenya and Chad have like large amounts of like ferrous deposits, and as a result, these ferrous deposits are the only way for them to benefit properly, right? They have to have control over them as a result, and when they have that control, they'll actually be able to, prosper economically. I say, great. That's probably something that would happen if, these nations actually had full control over these nations. I think that what happened after post-colonial era, or post-colonialism, and something that's actually been negated all across the opposition bench, is that neocolonial policies or neoliberal policies are still something that were actually evident in society, right? Like, along with the banner of neoliberal policies and the Washington Consensus, we had heavy privatization and commodification of environment within a lot of these developing countries. Now, what happens as a result of this is these countries no longer have the ability to fully control their economy or control the resources within their economy. So I say, fine, if the vulnerable states can control this is probably something that's going to be beneficial. But when we have countries in Kenya where they don't necessarily receive the full profits of these types of resources because developed countries send charter companies into these areas and use a form of imperialism to actually exploit these resources, I say that that's where we actually have a negative harm, right? I say that that's when we actually don't have development occurring in these nations, but we have an underdevelopment and a poverty trap and a cycle of poverty release, like in these countries, because first of all, individuals in these countries end up working for a low wage, and then on top of that, the government as a whole cannot profit off of it fully. They can only generate profit by taxing this privatized company, and as a result, they don't necessarily have to generate the income properly. So I think if we're doing it in the comparative, and we compare the benefit that's actually going to be coming by sharing these types of income, like sharing this type of income, and like putting across this type of money per capita to a bunch of individuals, I say that these countries probably will receive more money on the whole because under the status quo, they don't necessarily receive the full share of what they're given, right? I think under the status quo, and that's something that they gloss over, they don't necessarily receive everything because of the taxation that occurs, and you like to disagree.
Yeah, this isn't about full share, it's about full value. They may not receive the full value of blood diamonds, as your partner talked about, but make no mistake, the warlords in Kenya are in control of that revenue. The money stays within Kenya. It is not solely outsourced to America.
Great, the money stays within Kenya, but it doesn't go to the right forms of development, right? Like I think if they want to talk about development as a whole, and they want to talk about how these types of neoliberal policies are going to help them, all I say is that it helps the infrastructure and the chartered companies that are in these areas to continue to exploit and doesn't necessarily stop the exploitation that's there. And I think that's really what Luca talks to you about. So I'm going to go on to that, right? I think if we're looking at this idea that Luca brings to you of mining or not to mining, I think what we see is that that countries are not going to have the incentive, or chartered companies are not going to have this incentive to go into these nations and do these types of things because they're not actually receiving direct profit back from it, right? So essentially what's going to happen is they're going to stop actually taking these types of taking this type of infrastructure out of it, which allows first of all Kenya or Chad or whatever they would like to talk about in landlocked countries to actually develop their own infrastructure and develop ways to actually mine in a sustainable manner that's going to be beneficial for them and not reliant or have this dependency that we like to hear all across that opposition bench, right? It allows them the opportunity to create this form of development that's going to be beneficial for them. I think moreover, on top of that, what happens that if these countries that receive the money because of this profit sharing environment, like Britain or like America, like they like to bring up time and time again, want to receive more money and want to do it in a profitable manner, then they will have to cooperate with these nations and do it in a way that's possible, right? In a way that's actually going to be beneficial, both environmentally, both for the people, but also for the state that's going to be mining these types of things. I think that's where we get the benefit from us. Luca talks about Bolivia, and I think the reason we have to look at Bolivia is because they have the largest lithium deposit in the world. Now, what is lithium used for? Lithium is actually used for generating batteries, right? So if we look at electronic cars, which is something that are going to be very, very big in the future, lithium in Bolivia is actually going to be the major resource for that. Now, if we look at this, the issue is Bolivia does not have the resources to be able to develop these types of things. They do not have the infrastructure to actually mine it and actually refine it into batteries. But one issue with that is the fact that Bolivia doesn't want to trust Western countries to come in, or the global north to come in, because they will actually ruin the infrastructure within these nations, right? They're very hesitant to take the type of help from these type of people. So essentially what happens is if we have a form of cooperation that's based off of everyone going to be benefiting, and not necessarily Bolivia being screwed over by Western countries, we get more lithium on the whole for everyone, but we also get money market sharing going to everyone, and as a result, more development for Bolivia, but also more money being given to everyone across the world. So I say if we're looking at it from a developmental perspective, I think there's more benefit coming to the developing country in terms of it being able to develop its own infrastructure that isn't reliant on other people if they actually have the ability to produce this type of infrastructure in a way that is going to be beneficial for them through cooperation, through the things that Luca points out to you. Now, the major question that comes out of side opposition when they asked this in a POI to Luca was basically, what incentive do these countries have? I say that the incentive that they have is basically going to rely around the fact that they do receive a market share of these types of things that they gladly point out in the extension speech, right? He says that these countries that have a large amount of capita are going to still receiving money. And I say that's fine. I say that's going to be incentive for them to actually help these countries in producing more and producing in a sustainable manner, in a way that's going to be environmentally friendly, in a way that's actually going to be good for these people. I say that that's something that's better on the whole. Okay. Last thing that we need to look at is how development occurs best, and actually how this development is going to look under our side of the house. I think what we actually end up doing on our side of the house is actually getting rid of this type of poverty trap. Like, a lot of post-development theorists look at this idea of the poverty trap and essentially talk about foreign direct investment. Essentially what they say is that this foreign direct investment allows countries that take this this investment from other countries, and it allows or foreign aid from these countries, and basically allows them to put this money into public infrastructure, into public development, through microfinancing, through doing things like this, right? By basically allowing individuals within the nation nation to have more money to invest, allowing the whole economy as a whole to have more public savings, and as a result can build into their infrastructure. Now, the reason that this doesn't happen under the current status quo is because of the privatization that we hear from neoliberal policies, right? So the second that we hinder the ability for these chartered companies or for the multinational corporations to go in here and actually stop these types of things, what we get is a direct opposition or direct clash to them, right? I think we have a mechanism by which these countries are actually going to be able to have foreign direct investment because they're receiving money for the things that they're doing. They're receiving money back from the actual things that they're producing. And as a result, these minerals are going to enable them, or the production of these minerals are going to enable them to have a foreign direct investment, a form of income that will allow them to actually have public savings, and as a result, have sustainable development, right? I think the whole idea of, or concept of development has moved beyond the concept of, just receiving funds or receiving exploitation from these countries and then developing as a whole by having a free market. I think it's a lot better to protect these countries by having a safer economy for them, a safer and more protected economy, and an economy that they can control themselves by doing these types of things. And it's for these reasons that we are proud to propose it.
I'd like to thank the government whip for his comments, and now I'd like to welcome the opposition whip.
Coming from close in opposition, we believe that a policy should only be passed, particularly as controversial as redistribution, whether it be from wealth, from diamonds, or altogether. We think that it needs to be passed only A, if you're going to actually have positive benefits or outcomes from it, or B, there is this overall moral or principle stand that can be proven, right? Neither of these are proven from side government, and in fact, most of it is teared down by my partner, and we think that overall we're going to be able to win this debate. I'm going to explain this during the 2 points of crystallization. I have 2 questions. First, is this legitimate on a principled or theoretical stance? Overall, this is the large extension my partner brings to you. The answer, of course, is no. I'll explain why through what my partner brought to you, and also intertwined refutation. And the second is going to be, if this policy was passed, is it likely to produce more net benefits or net harms? The answer is net harms. I'll explain why to you. Therefore, you should never pass something like this on a principled and pragmatic level. But before I do, I really need to clear up some things, right? Because I'm going to be totally honest, I'm going to make this real right now. We heard some real shiftiness coming from the opening gov and then the closing gov, right? Somehow we heard coming from the opening government in this nebulous model that it sounded like a check was going to be made to every single individual in this country, right? That's how it sounded like. It said that we're going to be able to solve poverty, and individuals are going to be able to use that money. And then somehow from closing government we moved to having foreign direct investment. And I'm not quite sure at what point we're supposed to be arguing, right? At what point did it make this shift? Either you're going to be giving the money directly to individuals, right, that live within that country, and then you're not gaining any of the benefits coming from the closing government because it's not foreign direct investment, or what you're going to have is this foreign direct investment, but then if these countries are corrupt, as closing government says they are, the money is not going to be used for the correct things, right? So either way, you're not gaining the positive benefits that government wants to bring to you. I really needed to clear that up. So now let's go into the 2 points of crystallization, not right now. Is this legitimate on a principle or theoretical stance? My partner explains to you why sovereign nations ought to remain sovereign, right? And it's not just because we think that countries have power and therefore they should just be able to hoard all of this profit. It's because they have a responsibility to the people that they are serving. They are elected inside government of whatever government structure it may be. And we think that my partner actually brings to you case studies that are the particular nations that are going to be most affected by this, right? If coming from opening government they say that they want to help the most poor and impoverished nations, then let's talk about those nations, and that's what Camden does for you. He talks to you about those landlocked countries that happen to be inside of sub-Saharan Africa, right? He talks to you about Chad and gives you the examples that these areas are now going to be unable to mine even more because they're going to have to share all those profits, right? This is one of the sole reasons that they're actually able to provide for their people, and now it's being able to take it away from them. Not only are they taking away economics, which we think the opening have covered, but my partner expanded upon this and taking away the political power. Why are they taking the political power and how? Because this money is directly tied to what they are able to provide for their people. This is the only thing that's able to sustain them, right? And then we hear coming from closing government that, well, these countries are not able to, they don't have the power inside these countries to be controlling the mining and stuff, right? That's just simply not true. The blood diamonds in which they use themselves are being controlled by the warlords that happen to exist inside of those countries. So yes, we do believe that the countries themselves can control this. My partner explains this to you. Overall, we think a legitimacy behind a government is to uphold the duty for answering for those people. Why will this not happen? Because the opening government and really closing government so conveniently left out the part of where we're giving money per capita, right? So even best case scenario, right, you're spreading all this money around, most of the money are not going to go to these individuals. And the large problem that we heard coming from the last speaker was saying, well, they can't profit off of it fully. Yeah, nobody's profiting off of anything fully, but they sure will get more than if they have to split it up per capita, right? This is just simple numbers, and my partner mainly explains this to you. He's actually the first one in the round to bring up how we must discuss per capita, right? Because we can't just theoretically talk about all of this, but overall, these nations need to be able to answer for their people. I'll take you in a moment. So my partner overall brought to you the legitimacy that we must uphold. He gave you examples like Kenya and Chad and how the case study that we brought to you is most prevalent. Why is it most prevalent? Because the problem brought to you by the opening government to solve poverty, they literally broke it down to you into 3 points as to why this is so important, cannot be done if these countries cannot provide for their people. These countries will not be able to provide for their people if the one resource they have is being taken away from them. And no, not just gold and diamonds, but like my partner brought to you, copper and a lot of the material that they actually make the most money off of. Go ahead.
These individuals will these individuals not have the ability to provide themselves when they're receiving checks from the minerals that they produce, but also minerals that other countries produce, and then be able to invest that in an economy and develop their entire economy as a whole because of that investment that's coming into them?
No, now you don't know who's producing what, right? Because you can't actually take, credit for whatever you happen to have in your country. If Chad happens to be a country that has a ton of minerals, now they have to go ahead and spread that amongst the rest of the world. There's no way to say, well, I get to keep what I have and then also what you have. That's not how it works, right? It's just not. So overall, my partner and I stand on the ground that this is not legitimate on a principle or theoretical stance. But second off, right, we think we need to talk about if this is passed, is this likely to produce more net benefits or net harms? And overall, we heard coming from the opening government these lines that somehow this check will be able to solve poverty. I'm not quite sure how that will happen because A, this mining and minerals corruption will still exist, right? You're not taking out the governments that happen to exist in these areas, so I'm not quite sure what they're solving there. But B, they even said on their side of the house that they don't want to throw money at a short-term solution. That's literally exactly what you are doing. Why? Because you are not solving for the underlying problems that exist in these countries as to why these minerals are not being spread around, right? As to why these people are impoverished and in poverty to begin with. Instead, you say either A, you're giving a check to people that happen to live there, or B, you do what the closing government's trying to do. Either way, it's not getting to the right individuals. Overall, we think that this there's going to be less foreign investment because these individuals are going to see that they're not actually able to give to these countries, right? Because it has to be split up. So overall, what do my partner and I bring to you, and why did we win this debate? We think that this round was supposed to be talking, and everybody had engaged in talking about what is going to be the outcomes of this, right? Should this happen, and if it does, would it be beneficial? My partner and I explained to you that the legitimacy behind these governments, particularly the countries that are going to be most affected, are going to be the ones that now are not going to be able to answer to their people. Their political power are going to be taken away, and overall, we think that is quite possibly the worst damage you could do. There's also net harms that come from this, and for all these reasons, I am so proud to oppose this motion.